Bonjour à toutes et à toutes, tous. Bienvenidos a todos y todas. Welcome everybody. Super appreciation for those who can join us this afternoon. My name is Viviana Fernandez and I am Associate Director at the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. As a host of this webinar in the context of our Scholars at Risk U Ottawa program, with our partners, the Scholars at Risk Canada section, we are delighted to present the second session of a webinar series titled International Tools to Advance Academic Freedom. This activity was conceived to mark the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Scholars at Risk network. The University of Ottawa joined the SAR network in 2014, and since then, our center has developed a robust program that engages in hosting scholars, monitoring and advocacy activities, as well as educational initiatives such as these webinars. Over the last few years, we have seen, heard, and perhaps experienced an increase in attacks to academic freedom. So we want to inform our audience about relevant international tools and efforts in the higher education space, which could prove useful. The first session, which you can view on our YouTube channel, focused on the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, which were adopted in 2021. During the conversation, we introduced how the principles came to be, explained their content, and illustrated some applications for the region. Today's session focuses on the recognition of academic freedom by the United Nations and international bodies as an independent and interdependent human right essential to democratic societies. We are very lucky to have today three knowledgeable speakers. The first one is Mr. Gustav Kessel, Special Advisor to the International Science Council's Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. And we are very, very grateful for his early morning participation in this webinar because he's from New Zealand. Jesse Levine, he is a longtime colleague at Scholars at Risk and Senior Advocacy Officer. And Salvador Herencia Carrasco, who is part-time professor at the Faculty of Law here at the Civil Law section, also a member of our center and a legal advisor of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas. The webinar will start with 10 to 12-minute presentations by our speakers, followed by questions from the audience. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function, which will allow us to address some of them in writing or live. Please, Gustav.
Okay, hello everyone. I'll go ahead and share my my slides. Let me know once they're ready. Can you see that?
Yes, thank you.
So hello everyone. I'm Gustav Kessel. Oh, I've just frozen. Damn it.
We can see you fine. There is no lag on our end.
No? Okay, great.
No,
sorry, I have a little bit of lag, so bear with me. I'm Gustav Kessel, Special Advisor to the International Science Council's Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science, joining you from Wellington in New Zealand, where I'm based at the Royal Society of New Zealand, Te Aparangi. It's a pleasure to be here today talking to you. I'm going to spend the next 12 minutes or so just talking you very briefly through the freedoms that the ISC sees as essential for the practice of science, the threats against these freedoms that we see worsening around the world, and how we respond to those threats, including a very quick outline of our interpretation of the human right to science. So the International Science Council, or ISC, is the largest science NGO of its kind in the world, being composed of over 250 diverse member organizations of many different kinds. And most importantly, the ISC uses a very broad and inclusive definition of the word science, encapsulating really all knowledge that can be rationally explained and reliably applied. when we're talking about science, we really mean something closer to the German word Wissenschaft. It represents a kind of knowledge ship. And it's the ISC's vision for this understanding of science to be advanced as a global public good. That is to say, a resource, a beneficial resource that is freely available to anyone to use and to benefit from. And the ISC promotes and protects this vision, and it's underpinned by our principles of freedom and responsibility in science. So these principles lay out the freedoms that should be enjoyed and the responsibilities that are carried in the practice of science. And they apply at all levels of the science system, not just to individuals, but going through to institutions and organizations and up to national governments. And you'll have noticed me talking a lot about science. The ISC tends to talk about scientific freedoms rather than academic freedoms. So these concepts obviously overlap and are closely related, but our understanding of scientific freedoms and responsibilities in our principles is somewhat broader in scope. And we see them as a tool in our work as a unifying normative framework. Scientific freedom, we find, is easier to understand in contexts outside of universities. And talking about scientific freedoms also allows us to avoid some of the differing interpretations of what constitutes academic freedom in the various legal contexts around the world. So these are our principles. I don't think I have time to go through all of them in detail. If you want to read more information about each of these clauses, please go to our website. I just want to emphasize here again that we see freedoms and responsibilities as two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And it's the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science job to monitor and respond to threats against these principles occurring globally, and to do that on behalf of the ISC. We're composed of 12 members, supported by an executive secretary and by myself as special advisor. And what we see is not looking good. Our own monitoring, as well as through data gathered and published by our collaborators and partners like Scholars at Risk, we are observing an overarching global trend of decline in scientific freedoms and in academic freedoms. This graph is taken from the latest version of the Academic Freedom Index, and you can see that average global academic freedom scores have been regressing over the last 10 years or so to levels reminiscent of the Cold War era. And what we see driving these trends are, firstly, the rise in authoritarianism around the world, which brings with it increased interference in institutional autonomy and with research agendas, and more state-sponsored targeting and suppression of individual scientists whose research conflicts with political agendas. Then we have escalating geopolitical tensions and conflicts. These bring restrictions on movements of scientists and on collaboration internationally. They also mean more and more really serious cases of political hostage-taking of scientists and wrongful detention. And probably most worryingly, this has already meant an increased frequency of crisis situations that pose really existential threats to the survival of entire national science systems and cultures. Only the last few years, for example, we've seen the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the civil wars in Myanmar and Sudan, the invasion of Ukraine, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and intense repression under the Ortega regime in Nicaragua, all causing wholesale science capacity losses. And on top of that, ideologically motivated attacks by non-state actors including members of the public, also still seem to be rising, and we see this especially in the climate, health, and social sciences. But those threats are all external to the science system. Internally, they're exacerbated by indications that fraud and misconduct are on the rise, by widespread silencing and intimidation of whistleblowers by institutions, and by the fact that despite much progress in many parts of the world, discrimination of all kinds really remains systemic in science from a global perspective. So that's the context within which we operate. And it's worth stating again that in the vast majority of cases that we actively follow, the state is the aggressor. So in responding to these threats, the committee tries to exert the ISC's influence, to raise awareness, and to provide direct support where we can. So we run quite a wide variety of activities. To do that, we publish official ISC statements and positions on specific cases. We engage in advocacy campaigns online. We write letters to heads of state. We publish blog series and podcasts and many more things. We also write major reports on a range of issues. You can see a few examples here. And we also run long-term projects. One example of that is our Science in Exile initiative, which is a network that aims to link up at-risk and displaced scientists with support. It's mainly benefited Ukrainian scientists so far. And another example of a project that we're running is the ISC's work to advance the right to science. So the set of rights, commonly known as the right to science, has a long history in human rights instrumentation. Probably most important in that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, which states that everyone has the right freely to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. This is not a legally binding document, but another important one, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from 1966, is an international human rights treaty that ratifying states have real obligations to adhere to. And this expands on the Universal Declaration in not only recognizing the right to science, but in articulating obligations around developing and disseminating science, protecting the freedoms necessary to do science, and fostering international collaboration as an important part of deriving benefit from science. But despite this history, obligations to the right to science have largely been ignored by state governments around the world. And partly that's because it remains a work in progress. There's a lot of uncertainty that remains around what actually counts as science in the context of human rights. The vague language typical of 20th century human rights instrumentation makes it really difficult to apply to problems facing science and scientists today. And also actually implementing a right with such far-reaching implications as the right to science is really difficult. It touches on knowledge production, public education, ethics, international collaboration, and many more aspects. So to address some of these issues, the ISC formulated its own interpretation of the right to participate in and benefit from science. And you can see that here, at least in poster form. And I hope that most of you will download that later. What we're aiming to do with our interpretation is to raise awareness of the right's existence and to promote its importance, and to clarify how instruments like the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant actually apply to the practice of science. And in doing that, we hope to facilitate the ongoing normative development of these rights. So again, I don't think we have time to go through this in detail, but I hope you will have a look at our interpretation online. Just want to show you very briefly that we've divided our interpretation of the right to science into two sets of rights. First, a right to participate in science, which includes aspects like the right to participate in generating diverse forms of knowledge. I wanted to stress that. The right to challenge established knowledge, to collaborate and engage across boundaries, to communicate, to form associations and societies, and to advocate for the responsible use of science. So if you want to know more about each of these clauses and how they relate to existing human rights instrumentation, please go to our website. Second set is about rights that allow you to enjoy the benefits of science. And very briefly, it includes things like a right not to be excluded on the basis of unjust discrimination, a right to equitably access information and other resources, and a right to apply scientific knowledge for good. So thanks very much. If you scan that QR code, it will take you to our Right to Science project page. The Right to Science has, for us, since we formulated it in 2024, become an important part of most of our work. And we advocate for most of our casework now using the Right to Science. It's a living document. We're actively gathering feedback by the ISC's members in the hope of updating and further developing it in the future. But already, some of our members are officially endorsing and adopting our interpretation. The Royal Society of New Zealand was the first to do so late last year, and we encourage all the ISC's members to do the same. If there's anyone in the audience who would like guidance on how to go about that for your institution, please get in touch. I look forward to doing my best to answering any of your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gustav. Yes, as mentioned in the chat, you will have the opportunity to review resources that our speakers are mentioning on the website of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, where the event was promoted. We will have a section there. As well, you will be able to see the video of this webinar on our YouTube channel in the same manner that you are already able to see the webinar we conducted last Monday. So on to our second speaker, Jesse, please. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Jesse Levine, Senior Advocacy Officer from Scholars at Risk. First of all, I just wanted to commend Gustav on his excellent presentation. It's always bracing to see how much overlap there really is between academic freedom and the right to science in terms of the challenges that we focus on, the ways that we approach them, the ways that we talk about the rights. It really is, we could speak volumes about that. We could have a seminar on that alone. So I'll start by talking about kind of the history of the development of the human rights conversation about academic freedom. I'll get into sort of the doctrinal development over the past 5 or 6 years. And then finally, I'll talk about where we're at now, which I think really is the question of how do we implement what we see as the human right to academic freedom at all levels, from the UN level down to the states and down to institutions themselves. And I guess the starting point would be, about 10 years ago, there really, the conversation about what academic freedom was at the, within international human rights spaces, among advocates, even among academics, was really substantially underdeveloped. We certainly would have argued that academic freedom was a human right protected under international human rights law, but there really hadn't been a detailed discussion about what academic freedom consisted of, what were its elements, where the lines were drawn between academic freedom and related rights, or for that matter, how bad the threats to academic freedom and attacks on academic freedom really were. Worse yet, human rights advocates, including within the UN and at the regional levels, really oftentimes weren't weren't identifying attacks on academic freedom and violations of the rights of universities, scholars, and students as such. Oftentimes, the kinds of attacks that we're all focusing on now were seen as violations of some other related but not coextensive right, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, or if a scholar was inappropriate, was wrongly imprisoned. It might be an attack on academic freedom that was driven by academic expression, might be framed as a violation of the right to be free from arbitrary detention. And the problem with that is that you miss the fundamental driver of the attack, and you don't deal with the causation. You deal more with the symptoms. So Scholars at Risk had a very particular vantage point to sort of identify this problem. Much of our work, in fact, the core of our work from the very beginning has been focusing on protection of individual scholars, scholars who were facing the worst kinds of attacks because of the exercise of academic freedom, attacks on their violations of their right to be free from arbitrary detention, violent attacks. And so our work was to, and remains, at its core, to assist those scholars by placing them in positions of sanctuary, and with substantial experience with these types of, with the scholars that we were helping, we were able to see that the problems that these scholars faced had similar shape, no matter where we were talking about. They were all on a continuum. Certainly, some scholars faced more violent attacks. Some scholars faced, sort of softer pressures. But the motivations behind the attacks were similar. And again, the human rights conversation about these attacks and the desire of authoritarians to silence scholars really was underdeveloped. So that led to really what is now Scholars at Risk's advocacy work. That included advocacy before the UN through the Universal Periodic Review system, which I can talk about a little bit if anybody wants to discuss it. Just in an effort to place academic freedom within the conversation, getting states to talk about violations of academic freedom by other states within the international human rights context. We also began around 2019, 2020, an effort to engage with UN special rapporteurs and other authorities to get them to really develop and work through the doctrine of what academic freedom is in much more detail than it had been previously. That led to a number of doctrinal advancements on what academic freedom is, beginning in 2020 with a report by David Kaye, the former UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, specifically on academic freedom. This was the first report of its kind within the UN system. And then the Inter-American Principles on Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, which came in 2021. In 2023, a group of 72 permanent missions to the UN in Geneva issued a joint statement raising concern over rising attacks on academic freedom, which I think followed those other doctrinal developments and sort of really was an alarm-raising moment that didn't have to begin with us human rights advocates, but instead came directly from the states, so we considered that a big win. Then in 2024, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Farida Shahid, issued her own report on academic freedom, obviously from a right to education perspective. And that attached a document called the Principles for Implementing the Right to academic freedom, which was established by a working group of international human rights experts, including my co-panelist Salvador, as well as UN officials and higher education experts. And that's really what I'd like to turn to right now. So I'm going to try my best to share my screen. Okay, give me 1 second. Share, okay. And then bear with me. Full screen. Are we good? Can everyone see it? Okay. So I'm just going to walk you through the principles for implementing the right to academic freedom. And I'll begin by talking about the purpose of this document. The idea was that the doctrine had been developed. We are at a place where I think the international human rights community has established a set of sort of doctrinal rules about what we mean when we say academic freedom, and what we think states that protect academic freedom are required, do when, what successful protection of academic freedom looks like. So the purpose of this document was to sort of marshal together the doctrine as it had been established by, again, the special rapporteurs and others, and then talk about what states, what the UN, and what individual institutions could do to ensure that academic freedom was being protected. So I'll go through the principles themselves, and then we'll get into the appendices, which I think are really what advance the doctrine, or what really advanced the conversation, I should say. So the first, very simply, academic freedom is the human right to acquire, develop, transmit, apply, and engage with a diversity of knowledge and ideas through research, teaching, learning, and discourse. I think the key there is that academic freedom is a human right. Okay, there are still some people in the higher education space, especially, that would beg to differ with that. But I think where the human rights conversation is at this point really is, it's pretty settled that we regard it as a human right, and I think that's a pretty significant advancement. Protected by existing international human rights standards and international education principles. We would go back to the right to freedom of opinion and expression, the right to education, and the right to science as underpinning the right to academic freedom. We are not creating a new right here. We are drawing on principles that are and have long been in existence. University autonomy, the protection, promotion, and enjoyment of academic freedom require the autonomy of academic research and teaching institutions. I think if you follow certainly developments out of the United States, as well as places like Hungary, you know that autonomy is one of the main things that's under attack when states target universities, takeovers of universities, attempts to gut both the faculty and the student body and replace them. These are very clear attacks on autonomy, and turning universities into organs of the state. So it's crucial that we highlight that. Academic research and teaching staff and students have the right to engage in expression and discourse with persons and groups inside and outside the academic research and teaching sector. One sort of core issue that we've talked about for years now has been the question of intramural versus extramural speech. Our position is that extramural speech, meaning speech expression within one's expertise, but outside the university, is a crucial part of academic freedom. And connected to that is the idea that universities have a right to engage with the public and a responsibility to be responsive to the public. So it's very distinct from the ivory tower model, right? The idea is that if you are a university, at the core of university life is your role, your public role. Enjoyment of academic freedom requires respect for the right to information, sources of information, and the tools, materials, and methods necessary to gather, develop, interpret, and share information and ideas. I think that sort of speaks for itself, but I'm happy to speak about it later. Enjoyment of academic freedom requires freedoms of movement and association. I think this one is one that, when I began doing this work, freedom of movement as something connected to academic freedom would have surprised me. But one of the things that states target first when they're targeting universities and they're targeting ideas is the ability of scholars of ideas to spread across borders. So it was very important that we include that in the principles. Academic freedom is essential to all levels of education, from early childhood through adult education and all types of academic research and teaching institutions. This does not mean that a elementary school child or a child in primary school has the same type of academic freedom rights that we enjoy at the tertiary level, but it is important that we note that as a human right, academic freedom does belong to everybody, and it is expressed differently at different levels, right? Moreover, you can't have pedagogy at any level without academic freedom at the sort of core tertiary level. So this was a crucial piece of this. As members of education communities, students have the right to academic freedom. Again, this was not something that everyone necessarily would have agreed on 10 years ago. I think it's safe to say that at this point, at least within the human rights space, talking about academic freedom, it's pretty well agreed that students are entitled to academic freedom and to engage in the same, with academic material, and they have the same right or a similar set of rights to faculty and staff. And then finally, the Principle 9 is about the state's responsibility and sort of everyone's responsibility to protect and respect academic freedom. The state has a prime responsibility and duty to protect, promote, and fulfill all human rights, including academic freedom. Everyone has a right and responsibility, individually and in association with others, to respect, promote, and strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms, including academic freedom at the national and international levels. And I think that leads very nicely into the implementation pieces. I mean, the idea is that institutions absolutely have to do a better job of engaging with their own responsibilities to protect academic freedom, just as states do, just as the UN does. So we can get into how they need to do that. So the appendices for this document, which I commend to all of you to read in more detail, really are, I think, the core of the document. The first of the two appendices is ideally for people like UN stakeholders, right? If you're conducting a country visit and assessing, or anyone else whose job it is to assess how well a state or institutions within a state are protecting the human right to academic freedom, this is a potential tool that you might use. And obviously it's a snapshot in time of where the human rights doctrine is now. It will probably develop further, but I think this provides a pretty good set of questions that stakeholders might ask themselves when assessing whether academic institutions in that state are sufficiently autonomous, whether autonomy is being protected sufficiently, whether again, the above considerations that I just talked about are being met. And then
One last
finally,
minute, Jesse, I'm sorry.
oh, thanks. I had no idea. Finally, practical guidance on implementing the right to academic freedom. This really is for everyone who has, for entire societies. It's for institutions. It's for, certainly it's for UN and regional stakeholders. But the idea is to give guidance to anyone who has, at the institutional level, who has the ability to shift policy and to and who would be inclined to think about what a more protective of academic freedom version of my institution would look like. We talk about statements of values. We talk about complaint systems. We talk about an academic freedom ombudsperson. We thought a lot about how to incorporate academic freedom better into systems of employment, retention, advancement, etc. Again, I won't go through the whole list. I think it's probably a little bit better read. And I will end there, I suppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Salvador, please.
Good afternoon, muy buenas tardes to everybody, and it is a great pleasure to be with all of you here today. And my name is Salvador Herencia, and I do not have a PowerPoint or a screen to share, but I would like to just focus this 10 minutes and 30 seconds, which I just started on the clock here, to discuss three points regarding the implementation or the standards in the protection or recognition of academic freedom. One is that academic freedom has always been playing catch. And we are now seeing the consequences of this situation. If you take a look at the UN Human Rights Council Special Procedure website, you will see that there are 46 thematic mandates and 13 country mandates. None of them have a specific agenda to monitor academic freedom. And this is a problem because when you are advocating for a right, you also need to identify who is entitled to protect it, right? And where you can file complaints, reports, petitions, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, it's just, as I like to say, unfortunately, a piece of legal poetry. Something that sounds nice, sounds interesting, but doesn't really affect or has a real impact on real life. And we're now seeing the consequences of this. Because for many years, and just as Gustav and Jesse were mentioning before, we see, okay, academic freedom has, of course, relation with freedom of expression or freedom of speech, peaceful assembly, equality, non-discrimination, education, science, so on and so forth. But then when you have too many relations or correlations, then responsibilities and recognitions fade away. And this has been the challenge that we've seen for on the international recognition of academic freedom as an independent right on its own. Up until not even 5-6 years ago, the main documents addressing academic freedom were 1997 resolutions by UNESCO. So this is a significant problem that we've always seen within academia or within the recognition of academic freedom, that there was not enough. How can you implement something that even international organizations are not worried about? Because for you to implement, you use, especially if you're working on the implementation of international norms, you need cases, you need resolutions, you need soft law instruments, decisions, so on and so forth. But in its absence, then you see this different approaches and understandings to academic freedom. For example, here in Canada, academic freedom is mostly protected as part of collective bargaining agreements. But in other countries, these are recognized as constitutional rights. So in its own, and I'm not saying that one is better or worse than the other, but on their own, there are different approaches and understandings of what academic freedom is and what academic freedom are the duties of states, but also of higher education institutions. As Gustav and Jesse were also mentioning, since let's say 2020, there has been a wide array of documents or reports addressing or trying to work on the implementation and recognition of academic freedom. Reports from former and current special rapporteurs, the Inter-American Human Rights Principles that we discussed last week and were adopted in December 2021, the ISC Understanding on the Right to Science and its contemporary interpretation on the right to science, and last but not least, the UNESCO guidelines also for hosting scholars that were adopted in 2025, among other instruments. So we have seen in the past well, we're already in 2026, so 7 years, give or take, a number of instruments that we can say confidently that we are starting to get materials under which states and higher education universities can actually work on the implementation. On Jesse's presentation, you could see how all these different principles are also broken down, whether you call it checklists, items, or even language that can be used to adopt policies or legislations are included within this context. And I think that these instruments it's not that they are adding, but they are consolidating a contemporary approach to what academic freedom should be understood. Which leads me to the second point, which is what are the main elements regarding the right to academic freedom that, for better or for worse, our colleagues at SAR, us at the University of Ottawa and the Human Rights Research Education Center, and also ISC, right? What are we trying to do with this? First of all, is to recognize academic freedom as an internationally protected right. Regardless of its recognitions and correlations with the rights that I have mentioned before, this has a legal standing on its own. The second point is that academic freedom covers all members of the academic community. This includes professors, not just tenure professors, but also part-time professors and anybody teaching at higher education institutions, students, and also administrative staff. I would be worried on saying that the issue of the students being part of or covered by academic freedom is an issue that is no longer under debate. Here in Canada, it is one of the elements of debate, especially in issues related to student encampment and the rights and prerogatives that they might have, because it all depends on the university and the collective agreement that each university might have. So there is an unequal, at least in Canada, not to say in other jurisdictions and in other countries. A third element is, again, mirroring what Gustav said, there are two sides to every coin. Academic freedom goes, the other side is institutional autonomy. And if we see reports from the Free to Think report or the Academic Freedom Index, we'll see that the decline that is happening in academic freedom and in the recognition and protection of the right to science, it also comes with attacks to institutional autonomy. Whether you're talking about Mexico, whether you're talking about Iran, whether you're talking about any other countries that we see on the news, these always go hand in hand. So these two sides are important and comprehend a significant element of protection and recognition of the right to academic freedom. And the final element is how to integrate academic freedom with other rights, not just correlation or elements of, but integrated in its protection and advancement. We were mentioning about the right to science. I would like to mention a case from the Americas. In last year, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights adopted its advisory opinion on climate emergency and human rights. It is one of the most complete advisory opinions that I have ever read. It is available in English on the court's website. But it is important that in all these 300 pages of decision, there are elements that are very important for this topic. Here, the court expressly says that the right to science is fundamental to adopt public policies to address and mitigate the impacts of climate change. But in addition to that, such policies must be based on empirical evidence available at the time. In a context where there is a political and divide regarding climate change, right to science, this type of legal recognitions are fundamental because they're talking about universities, they're talking about research centers, they're talking about freedom of universities to conduct research and to propose solutions linked to the participation in the public discourse in society about these topics. So you start to see flourishes or elements of academic freedom and right to science making its way to the courts because of the situations that we're currently facing and that we now have a growing set of standards and norms. However, there are elements here that are worth assessing for future debates. For example, Western knowledge or Western outputs is science. Indigenous outputs is knowledge or traditional knowledge. There is a discriminatory element in that differentiation. And if we're going to talk about academic freedom, we need to underlie or understand the biases that exist in the terms that we use. And that is something that unfortunately the court does not address. It pretty much copy-pastes different organizations from the UN and from the inter-American system. So us working or interested in academic freedom, this is a topic that we should be able to understand and focus on an honest discussion on these matters. To conclude, Viviane, to respect the time that I have been allocated, when we talk about implementation, we always talk about like top down, right? What does the international law have created? What international bodies, decisions? But perhaps in academic freedom, there is a great chance for us, members of civil society, members of academia, to actually contribute to the adoption of these standards. The Inter-American Human Rights System that we mentioned last week and the working group on academic freedom that Jesse was presenting was pretty much the work of civil society and members of the academia contributing to this. The UNESCO guidelines on hosting scholars was also with my colleague Viviana Fernandez, participated actively in the discussions and deliberations of the final text. So if there is a room, if there is a field on this complex times that we have regarding what is international human rights, it is the chance to work on academic freedom and to actually try to make the fight to have it recognized and fulfilled by all stakeholders. And for us, I see the participation before courts or even the submission of shadow reports to UN treaty bodies, like the one that our clinic with the University of British Columbia will submit in an hour and a half to the Human Rights Committee, as opportunities for us to put as a central topic the protection of academic freedom under international human rights law. There is a chance, and we're always happy to work in partnership with all of you. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Salvador. Thank you to our three speakers. There's definitely lots to unpack and the time is short. So for those questions that were addressed specifically to the International Science Council, some of these answers were already provided directly to the to the participants who were inquiring. Salvador, somebody was asking about the reference to the advisory opinion, so perhaps you can provide that as well. And there was a question about whether the right to science included the right to indigenous peoples or indigenous science, and the answer is yes. It is a right that is seen as inclusive and not just in the realm of social sciences and humanities, but also extending to indigenous and traditional knowledge systems. So that was Gustav's answer prior to this. in terms of the questions that we have not addressed yet, so Marta was asking, do ISC interest extend to institutional violations of right to science, or are they limited to state level? Perhaps, Gustav, you want to comment very briefly?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that question in the chat. Could you repeat what the question was?
So
sorry?
do ISC interests extend to institutional violations of right to science, or are they limited to state level?
Of course, as I was saying, we're interested in all levels of the science system. So not only states violating rights, but also institutions failing in their responsibilities that are implied by the interpretation of the right to science. One way that we're following that currently is retaliation against whistleblowers of wrongdoing, which we're seeing as a spreading problem in institutions around the globe. That's a very quick answer for you.
Yeah.
But also at the individual level, this fraud and misconduct is a big issue for us that also relates to the right to science, and it's important to keep in mind the limits of the rights as well. But it's another conversation.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answers your question.
Yes. So going through the questions, we have one that has to do with trade unions, faculty members, and their role in protecting academic scientific freedoms and how. And this is a question that would be important for us in Canada, especially as Salvador mentioned. So any comments? Perhaps, Salvador, you can start.
Salvador?
Yes, sorry, I was just finishing reading the question, right? So, Dominique, thank you very much for your question. Already, I put the link of the advisory opinion on the chat for everybody to see. I just say that it is the unions have a role to play, okay? And unions, from what we've seen in a report regarding Quebec's Bill 32, in a way, it has helped or contributed to protect part-time professors or professors that were not covered in principle by the protections and freedoms under academic freedom. So I think that there is always a role for unions, and especially when you see the contrast, when you see the corporativization of certain and of university interests. So the standing of unions have a significant role. However, one does not affect, or one does not contrapose the possibility of understanding academic freedom as an international human rights. And for many years, there have been attempts, as you know, Dominique, to actually have academic freedom alleged violations to be protected under the Charter. Unfortunately, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court of Canada has not recognized that, although we might see hopefully some openings in future cases that might be making their ways through courses as now. So I'll leave it for here, Vivian. I don't know, for Jesse or yeah.
So I would just add that, I mean, that's a very important point. I mean, there is this sort of tension between academic freedom as what we talk about it as a human right, and we contrast that to it being a guild right, a right of special people who have a special, special jobs. I think we would differ with that position. However, there's no question that unions in the United States in particular have been responsible for much of the doctrine around academic freedom. They are, as we face our own sort of domestic problems, unions are very much allied and sort of a part of the cohort of groups doing the strongest advocacy. So it's a very, very natural alliance. I would also add that where there are strong student unions, there's a lot of potential for the further development of academic freedom doctrine and adoption at the institutional level. And unfortunately, in the West, the student unions are not as strong. But I think that is part of our project, is to engage students, and I think unions are a really good platform through which to do it, for what that's worth.
Thank you both. Our colleague Eric Sullivan from Université Laval asked about the definition of academic freedom and the clash between that concept and the right to mental health protection against psychological violence at work. Regular remedies on harassment are not used to work with academic freedom, and they do not know where to draw the boundaries of academic freedom. When the exercise of the right to academic freedom becomes a prohibited harassment, it seems that a lot have been said on the right of the academics, but not a lot have been said on the potential abuse of academic freedom, which may see in harassment situations involving, for example, professors versus administrative staff or graduate students, which is also another type of case that we have seen. So any brief comments on this? And I will take the last minutes as my right to moderator and ask a question to the three of you to close. So I don't know if Salvador, do you want to start on this one or have something to respond to, Eric?
Well, first of all, salut, Eric. Thank you very much for being here with us. I think that there's no doubt that no right can legitimize violating or breaching other people's rights. And for us, I can only speak from the cases that as the human rights research and education center have supported, that pretty much 90% of all the cases that we've worked on are focusing on abuses by university administrators or university governance members and deans of faculty towards early career scholars or feminist scholars. So these elements we've seen over and over again. And for us, it is always important to understand something that actually UNESCO wrote back in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, that universities are a safe space free from any form of violence, whether it's physical or mental. So in a way, I think that by using this international instrument, we have been trying, in mostly successful cases, understanding and protecting the rights of academics and the members of academic community from this type of harassment. So, but again, there's much work to be done, and the use of international instruments can only support, right, existing national, local, or university guidelines. So that's why the importance for us on academic freedom to also, this is not just a state-driven, but universities have a role to implement proper guidelines to assure the fulfillment of academic freedom and institutional autonomy.
Any comments on this from Gustav or Jesse?
I defer to Salvador.
No.
I think that's a very good answer, very complete.
Thank you. So to close, I would like to hear from you if there are any upcoming developments from where you're sitting that you are particularly excited about. So anything that you are working on, anything that you will be participating in the coming months that could give us a sense for perhaps a new webinar talking about those new developments. Let's start with Gustav.
Well, we've actually got a webinar coming up in early March on the ISC's position on funding transparency, which, if you're interested in the higher education system, I would assume many of the audience are interested in that as well. And funding transparency specifically as a way of safeguarding against the hijacking of the science system by vested interests, for example, political or industrial interests. But the Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science has just concluded a couple of months ago a big meeting here in New Zealand for the first time, where we planned our next 2 years of work, pretty much. And the ISC is going through a bit of a sea change at the moment, and I can't say too much about it yet, but please expect a lot more vocal output from the ISC on many of the issues that we cover in the near future.
Sounds great. Jesse?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. I do want to note that this year there is a biennial resolution on freedom of opinion and expression coming up. Academic freedom has never been mentioned in that resolution. This is at the UN Human Rights Council. Academic freedom has never been mentioned. So we're hoping and pushing for it to be mentioned in the context of that document. And I think that in any event, whatever happens with the resolution, there will be work, as there always is, to do at the Human Rights Council session in June. And stay tuned otherwise.
Wonderful. Salvador?
Yes. Well, thank you, Viviana. And first of all, what I said it at the end of my presentation, in 90 minutes at the latest, we should be submitting to the UN Human Rights Committee a report that was done by the International Human Rights Law Clinic at the University of British Columbia and our Human Rights Research and Education Center, a shadow report for the upcoming review of Canada by the Human Rights Committee in March of this year. This report focuses on academic freedom in Canada. That is the final title that we've decided. Keep it short and simple on this matter, and we hope to share it with all of you once this our report has been accepted by the UN treaty body system, and perhaps even hold as presentation, because it's been a great work by different organizations and people highlighting or identifying the need to advance academic freedom in Canada. And so that's for now, but I think there are more that I'll let Viviana do the honors in presenting.
Well, just to close, thank you first to our three presenters. Again, lots to unpack and lots to keep discussing. And please stay tuned to our websites for future events and activities. And also thank you to our partners at the Scholars at Risk Canada section for endorsing this activity in the context of SAR's 25th anniversary. And something that I shared on the chat as well is the fact that we are going to be hosting the fifth CAFA conference, so the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas Coalition. And we are very excited about that. And we have a call for papers on running at the moment. So those who are interested in participating this year as a panelist, we would be delighted to receive your submissions. So thank you all for staying with us during this lunch break. And thank you again, Gustav, for the very early morning. And hope to see you soon in another webinar. Bye.